This is KAZU, Radio with a Choice in Pacific Grove. My name is Mae Brussell. The title of my program is World Watchers. It is program number 830, November the 2nd, 1987. Before I begin the program, I want to thank the various persons who have contributed towards this program. We thank Coast Components at 684-1185. The Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that helps bring you the following hour of World Watchers. The following hour of World Watchers is made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. The views expressed here are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo staff or the board of directors. The season is coming for holiday gifts, and people called me last week on the talk show part of my program asking about various subscriptions and the addresses of certain magazines and books, bookstores or whatever that are available for research that is hard to get. And I made a list for people who want ideas for birthday presents, Christmas, Hanukkah, or anniversaries, or just to keep up on the news. This is a pretty good list, and I took it from material that I have at my own house that I use. So if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me, Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922, I'll send you this list. There's 56 addresses. There's information on how to get David Emory's tapes, Nip Tuck's tapes, Critique Magazine, the National Reporter, Intelligence Parapolitics that comes from Paris, Covert Action Information Bureau, Bulletin, The Lobster that's published in London, Response from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, New Times, Espionage Magazine, Executive Intelligence Review, Freedom, Media Action Group, and there's a long list, National Observer, Mother Jones, Amnesty International. In these times, there is a newsletter called Citizens Complaint Coalition for a New Foreign Policy that just came out this month. It's put together by David McMichael, formerly of the CIA, who is now working with the Christic Institute. You can see what he publishes. It's for agents who have left the intelligence community and want to form an organization of people who have objected to the past policies. They're supposed to be concerned, as the title says, with a new foreign policy. It bothers me that this doesn't include domestic policy. So we have to wait and see what this is about. I think that the domestic is important. It's hard to know what's going on overseas if you don't know what's going on at home. So if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll take care of that. Now, there are a few items, I call them one-liners, that I'll go through very quickly with you. One was the article of Alois Brunner, the Nazi that lives in Syria. Many of you might have seen this morning's San Francisco Chronicle, the quotation. He said he's not sorry for all the Jews that died in World War II. He said all of them deserved to die because they were the devil's agents and human garbage, and he didn't think it was important that they died. Brunner was the deputy and chief aide to Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible for a mass number of the deportations. He lives in Syria, and remember, Adolf Eichmann's boss over all of this was the great Otto von Borschwing, who conveniently moved to California and shared secretary-translator with Ronald Reagan for 8 years while he was governor, and then Helene von Dahm went on to Washington to make appointments. The new issue of Nation magazine, October 24th, 1987, has an article by Christopher Hitchens updating the October 80 surprise, and this has to do with Ronald Reagan's deal that he cut with Richard Allen and various persons in the Iranian government to hold the hostages until Ronald Reagan was elected, and then until he was inaugurated as president. This article has been coming out for a long time. Barbara Honegger was on a New York radio station this past week on NBC for 3 hours with Mansour don't know if I can pronounce it, Rafizadeh, and also with Bonnie Sarter, the former president of Iran. He's in Paris. There was a 3-way talk show of Barbara with the former head of the Savak, or that's the title he had. He represented the Iran government at the United Nations. And it was, I understand, a very good show. We'll have copies of the tape. She'll have them, and maybe we could make them available to people that want to hear a three-way conversation with a lady from Pacific Grove, California, a gentleman from New York, and one in Paris, all trying to say that the election was stolen, that Ronald Reagan literally stole the election. There's a bargain now on Ollie North dolls. The people that were making them said in the newspaper this past week that they're now considering making Jesse Jackson and Mikhail Gorbachev dolls. The children need a transcendental experience of playing with a leader. They'll put their heads on the dolls, and they'll have the Barbie and Ken bodies. Henry Kissinger has been giving interviews lately. This is one from the Kansas City Times saying if only he could run for president. Henry Kissinger was giving interviews for the London Times and also in Europe in the Sunday Telegraph in London. He regretted that he was barred by law from the highest office, and he said, yes, I would like to be president. It would have stirred great passion, he said. And also another long article from the Washington Times, Reverend Moon's paper. Kissinger is sidelined. He's restless and he's alarmed. And Kissinger is a person that I believe orchestrated the entire Iran-Contra affair for his own particular benefits and the people surrounding them. I haven't done those details on the air, but this article is about him sitting in New York and very frustrated and referring to the Democratic fools that are running for office that don't have any experience like Henry Kissinger, and that, of course, he'd like to be president, and he is sitting in the sidelines waiting, hoping, of course, that there'll be a constitutional change and this foreign-born would really become, I believe, the Fuhrer of America. Nation magazine, October 31st, has an article, Kissinger and the Dirty War. This is about his relationship to the Argentine junta, but he's been involved in every military coup, the death of every Democratic leader, and the putting of fascism into power in every government that he touched. It's interesting that they're bringing this out now because the story of Kissinger in Argentina has been available for a long, long time, but some people are slow learners, and now at this point maybe somebody smells him in the sidelines and they're going to publish a little bit more about Henry Kissinger. Now, the man that brought Fritz Kramer to this country, Kissinger's mentor, the great Peter Drucker, was in the Los Angeles Times article October 22nd, and it's a half-page story, and he's laughing at the Wall Street matters coming down, and he said, when you look at who dominates the financial scene, they're mostly people who weren't there 5 years ago. They have absolutely no judgment, and he referred to the Wall Street traders as a bunch of Balkan peasants stealing each other's sheep, and he's laughing at it. Peter Drucker was born in Frankfurt, Germany. He is living at Claremont in California, in Pomona. He teaches at the Claremont Graduate School of Business. He's 77 years old. He's written 22 books, and he's been very much a part of the scene that has caused this terrible tragedy economically, and he's laughing, and he has a strong fondness, besides his German heritage, with the Japanese government, and they're the successful one. So where he could have taken our corporation somewhere different, he calls us the Balkan peasants. And discussing the economy this past week, I heard the United States as referred to as a banana republic, and that is what we have become. The article on Peter Drucker says a former security analyst himself, the Vienna native, worked as a young man in the financial world in London and Frankfurt. Peter Drucker was born in Frankfurt, Germany, not in Vienna, Austria. Not that it makes any difference. Then they said Drucker, who speaks with a European accent, low-pitched voice, is vaguely reminiscent of Henry Kissinger, but it does go on to say of his close relationship to Kissinger associates, to Henry Kissinger, and to Fritz Kramer, who put Kissinger into business in the first place and got him located at Harvard after he was with the top Nazis at the end of World War II. The Soviet Union has published a retraction that was in their newspapers this past week saying, no, the Pentagon didn't create AIDS, and the Vatican came out with a report, no, John Paul I wasn't murdered. They're referring to the book written by David Yollop that suggests that John Paul I was murdered, and they've chosen just at this time, the book came out several years ago, to say the Pope wasn't murdered. The Russians are saying, no, America didn't make AIDS. The truth is that both stories come out eventually, and the facts that cause these allegations were strong in the first place, and it's interesting that they are responding to it. I got a call from John Judge today. He lives in Washington, D.C. He'll be back out on the West Coast pretty soon, the end of November through the end of December. And he said that the Christian Science Monitor had a list of disinformation that has been coming from the Soviet Union, such as the fact that America makes biological weapons to wipe out certain races, or that AIDS were started in the United States. And they said the fact that Israel was testing the neutron bomb in Cameroon. Now, as far as I know, I have to get in touch with a reporter from the Christian Science Monitor and see where he got that story, because as far as I know, I haven't seen a suggestion except for what I've had on World Watchers and spoken to various people from Cameroon and put together that I do indeed believe Israel was testing the neutron bomb there, but they must be talking about it in Europe and in other parts of the world now because it was important enough to put a denial. Anthony Lewis has a scathing report of Ronald Reagan in the paper today. He's writing about things that I had on the air in 1980 when Reagan was running for president. Some people are slow learners. The article is called Vacuum in the White House. And he talks about references in the Financial Times of London, read internationally, that we have absolutely no leader in this country, nobody's in charge, that this president is living with a mind of fantasy, he has no contact with reality, and it may take the two bakers, Howard Baker and James Baker, to put something together, get two cooks, they'll cook something up. And Anthony Lewis said they should create a meaningful financial policy. How do you do it with a president who not only fails to understand but actively resists reality? And they said that Reagan has been used for an ideological agenda, and the ideologues like what he is doing, but there's no way to handle what he's saying. He talks off the top of his head when he's let loose and conjures up all kinds of things that scare people. And then he gives an example at the bottom of the article how Ronald Reagan, even when he was first president, referred to Tip O'Neill and a desk he had that belonged to Grover Cleveland as reminding him of a movie he made with Grover Cleveland. And Tip O'Neill said, no, it was Grover Cleveland Alexander, the ball player. And this is what the world is watching now as the money is slipping away and the economy is shattered. There was an article just this past week in the L.A. Herald. The United States wants help for a chemical war on drugs. And the gist of the article is that Dow Chemical now wants to make herbicides similar to Agent Orange to spread on what they say are cocaine leaves, but they could cause cancer and could cause sickness, and Dow manufacturer doesn't want to be sued. So they want the United States government to say that no matter what they spray or how strong the herbicide or where it's given, that nobody will be sued if people die or have physical deformities. And the Reagan administration is supposed to ask Congress this week to give chemical companies immunity from lawsuits that rise over what they spray, whether it's for drugs or otherwise. The overt excuse is war on cocaine, but whatever slips or goes and falls on people, the drug companies should not be responsible for what they make. And the New York Times had a story this week. The release of altered microbes is approved in a tracking test. And again, we're back to the point where the Environmental Protection Agency has approved the release of gene-altered microbes designed to help scientists track other genetically engineered organisms. And in Medical World News this past month, September 28th, there's an article, Military's Biowarfare Research Under Fire. A man working at Fort Detrick, Maryland, up till last year, 1986, said they fail all security systems. There's missing vials of virus that are never accounted for, that they don't investigate where the viruses have gone. They left the laboratory, that the Army's list of facilities is insufficient, and biological warfare is now carried out at 60 universities, 20 laboratories, 20 to 530 corporations, and 25 to 30 other medical institutions all over the United States and with contracts overseas. In November 1987's issue of Progressive has an article, Poisons from the Pentagon, and I'm hardly touching the contents of these articles just to tell you what's out there while we begin spraying and while the chemical companies don't want responsibility for what comes out that they are testing in the air or on the plants that grow. The San Francisco Examiner had an article. It was also in several papers. The University of California in Santa Barbara has hired a CIA agent for the political science department. The professors are unhappy. George Critton Jr., a 2-year teaching post was given to him, and it was made without a vote of the political science department, and he is a participant in the political science activities at the University of Santa Barbara. If this continues to go through, he would be a CIA officer in residence program to enhance the CIA's recruiting. This is what they're afraid of. But the current political science department chairman said the department voted earlier this month to reconsider this. They weren't consulted at all. And, of course, political science is what the intelligence community wants to gear you to think one way and not the other. Now, last week on World Watchers, I discussed the probe of Edwin Meese, the Iraqi pipeline story that is so horrendous. His attorney, Mr. Robert Wallach, having a great share of the pipeline money. He made $1 million already from the legal fees, Robert Wallach. And he's Edwin Meese's personal attorney. And not only did he make $1 million already from the WedTech Corporation that has now since folded, but Edwin Meese put $60,000 into this project. And Mr. Wallach was using a Swiss banker, Bruce Rappaport, and the Rappaport was representing a co-partner of Bechtel Corporation, which is Caspar Weinberger, his former company, and George Shultz's former company. And at the same time that the government and Robert McFarlane and the National Security Council were sending weapons to Iran, this time period, 1965, the White House National Security Council was also planning to build a pipeline to Iraq. This is both the same people, both intentions, help Iraq with their oil and send arms to Iran. And Robert McFarlane was used by Robert Wallach for references into the Defense Department, where the bid would go through very nicely, except for the fact that Israel might bomb this particular pipeline, and they wanted to take Israeli money that was guaranteed by congressional votes as a down payment on an insurance policy to protect the pipeline. It wouldn't go to Israel. Israel bombed the pipeline. Now, the most interesting part about this story is that the company that was supposed to do all of this insurance and protection that went to the Defense Department and the National Security Council to protect the pipeline is called Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, which is described in the New York Times article as being a private company that insures American investment overseas. Now, the New York article from New York Times, October the 15th, was written by Jeff Gerth. He's one of the best researchers in the country. Many of you have the early Sundance article he did on Richard Nixon and the Mafia. It's a classic. That article is just marvelous. Well, Jeff Gerth wrote this account of the $1 billion pipeline that was supposed to go through with no bid, with the help of Edwin Meese, and Edwin Meese on with an investment in the company, WedTech. Robert Wallach, the attorney for Edwin Meese when he went through his financial problems, represents Bruce Rappaport, the client in Switzerland who would be building the pipeline. Bruce Rappaport and Wallach work closely with that insurance company, Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Wallach made $1 million from WedTech with Army contracts, non-competitive bidding. Wallach is the attorney for Edwin Meese. Wallach got Meese to invest $60,000 in WedTech, and Wallach is the attorney from San Francisco who got in trouble with other parts of WedTech. And he, at the time he represented Meese at the confirmation hearings for Attorney General, he excused Meese from paying a fee of $300,000 of legal fee, but then Meese was able to get him the contracts with WedTech, so he made $1 million. So you can subtract the $300,000 from the $1 million, and that's still his profit. And later, after being confirmed, Edwin Meese and Ursula put money into that company that Mr. Franklin Chin, the WedTech director, was advising them about. And all of this was going on at the same time they were planning the Iraq pipeline. The same people were planning to arm Khomeini. Now, the companion to that article, that was the New York Times, is written by Jonathan Quitney in the Wall Street Journal, titled Figure in Contra Network Got United States Loan for a Manufacturing Project. And the part about this story that connects to the other is that the same insurance company, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, according to Jonathan Quitney, is not a private company, but is a government company. And in fact, not only was going to oversee and guarantee the Iraqi pipeline, but they loaned $375,000 to John Hall in Costa Rica, one of the defendants in the Christic Institute suit. And besides that, the loan was made by Robert Owen, that baby-faced guy that got up and giggled and was so innocent-looking at the time of the Iran-Contra hearings. Robert Owen was the principal liaison to the Contras for the National Security Council, and he was also the one working for this same company to get a loan to John Hall. Now, the loan went down to Hall. He wanted another $550,000, and a total of $500,000 added to $375,000. And then the congressional investigators, or the powers that be, went down to see how he was using the money. And they found that the money wasn't, there was no record of the money John Hall was getting. This is Oliver North and Robert Owen through this company. It's similar, I suppose, the company is like Investor Overseas, the original Bernie Cornfeld, Robert Vesco scam, where the money was sent down to John Hall, and they found out the mortgage on Hall's property as collateral hadn't been registered at all, that their lawyer, they said, took away registration fees, and then later they said committed suicide. Now, there were other deaths on John Hall's ranch. There was a David who worked with persons, his name is in the Christic Institute affidavit, and then there was John Carr and Adler Barry Seal. And so the very attorney who worked with Robert Owen and Oliver North and this company, this mysterious company that does pipelines for Iraq, or was going to, is building up or funding John Hall for whatever reason. The attorney then is dead down in Costa Rica. Who would know if that was a suicide? So Hall has no collateral on the loan, and none of the original partners were available to explain where the equity went. They didn't put any into the company, and there were 3 investors that were supposed to be there. There aren't any signatures on it, and I believe this is going to be a very big story, because when you get Jonathan Quitney and Jeff Gerth on the same story in 2 different newspapers, and they connect the Iraq pipeline and the WEDTech and Edwin Meese and Bechtel Corporation and connected to Owen and North and the National Security Council, because the Iraq pipeline came through the approval of Robert McFarlane, the National Security Council, and these 2 things are going to merge. They're going to be very big, and they're very interesting. And in addition to John Hall getting that $375,000, the Washington Times had a long article back in July. CIA paid bill to guard the United States rancher who aided the Contras. The CIA was paying John Hall $800 a month for guarding his property where the airstrip was. He was paid by the CIA, and here comes this investment company that through Robert Owen, who gets him $375,000, not accounted for, and as I say, no collateral, no signatures, and bizarre stories going on John Hall's ranch. And this Washington Times article goes into Eden Pastora, who allegedly wanted to kill John Hall, and he was the person who was supposed to be killed the time that the La Penca bombing took place in Costa Rica. Pastora was confronting Hull because of the management of the Contras at the time. And another person who used to visit the ranch of John Hall was Hugo Spadafora. Spadafora is a gentleman that Mr. Noriega has been blamed for killing in Panama, and I have articles about Oliver North and Robert Owen being responsible for the murder of Mr. Spadafora in Costa Rica and blaming it on Noriega in Panama. So the CIA pays the bodyguards for a man where all these various people are dying or missing, and John Hall has been named as a defendant in the Christic suit for planning on his ranch the bombing where 7 people were killed and many more were injured and almost murdered. Now, one of the most interesting articles that I saw this week, and that's a real competition because there's so much in the news, is the one that came out in the New Yorker, October the 5th, 1987. The title is called Annals of Government, Policing American Writers. And there's been quite a few newspaper articles about the FBI following American writers such as Pearl Buck, Truman Capote, John Dos Passos, Theodore Dreiser, Faulkner, Hemingway, Sinclair Lewis, Archibald MacLeish, Carl Sandburg, John Steinbeck, Thornton Wilder, Tennessee Williams, Thomas Wolfe, and so forth. It got a lot of copy about 2 weeks ago that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was following writers. But what the New Yorker has in this article is that not only was the FBI keeping tab of these writers, but after 1947, when the CIA was formed, they turned the names over to the CIA, to Immigration Naturalization, the State Department, and the Army Intelligence, Navy Intelligence, Air Force Intelligence. And these raw files have now been obtained by somebody through the Freedom of Information Act who took several years to get the material together. And what he says in this article was that Ronald Reagan himself surfaced as a former FBI source with code number confidential informant T10. And he reminds us that in 1985 in the San Jose Mercury, August the 25th, there was an article that Ronald Reagan, as an active informer, was part of the Screen Actors Guild, served the Guild's president for several years, and worked as an informer for the FBI. Now, those were the early years when he was married to Jane Wyman. But what makes this article totally different than the years when he was informing, and the article goes on, in 1947, he and his wife, Jane Wyman, were interviewed by the FBI, and they were working in Hollywood with the Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of Art, Science, and Profession. Reagan provided the FBI with information regarding the activities of members of the Screen Actors Guild who were suspected of carrying on Communist Party work. The FBI memorandum say Reagan and Jane Wyman advised for the past several months during the Screen Actor Guild's meeting, cliques of members, one headed by name deleted, another by name deleted, and Reagan was particularly active as an informant while in the Guild as Guild president. In 1947, FBI reports state that Reagan said he had was made a member of a committee headed by Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, for the purpose of purging motion picture industry of communists, okay? And he worked with the House Un-American Activity in 1947, and the report uses his T10 number that he was talking about, show people and writers, and that they were under scrutiny for years, and that these files were round about the writers. But in between, or before the 1947 information, and also the expose of FBI informer in the 1950s, this article says there is information, the documents revealed that at the time Reagan was active with the Screen Actors Guild, he served as the Screen Actors president for several years, but he also worked as an informer for the FBI. Reagan's name first appears on FBI documents from 1941 when he was an agent in Los Angeles office, and cited him as a source for whom he had become intimately acquainted in 1941. Now, you regular listeners to World Watchers know that I have mentioned many times that I believe the time period when Reagan was making movies with Errol Flynn. Flynn was in the Gestapo, a long time earlier, but 1940, heavily involved with the Gestapo, and Reagan made a movie with him. He made another movie with him in 1942. And this was the height of the activities of Errol Flynn and the Gestapo. And I couldn't believe that the parts of Reagan that I knew and studied didn't involve that kind of activity in those dates. They made a Santa Fe Trail for Warner Brothers in 1940, Desperate Journey in 1942 at Warner Brothers. But in those years, he was already an informant for J. Edgar Hoover, which puts a different perspective on Reagan for some people, but only enhances what I know about Ronald Reagan. So seeing those dates, I went back to several book sources. One, the Interpol connections of J. Edgar Hoover, was vice president of Interpol. That was the German Nazi police force with Heinrich Himmler and the Waffen-SS and the top Nazis. Hoover was vice president of Interpol at the same time that Ronald Reagan was an informer for him in Hollywood. He only stopped after Pearl Harbor. He had to close off with autographed pictures back and forth to the top Nazis and cool it off for a couple more years, and then they were back waltzing together. And then I went into the George Seldes material that I shared last week on the air and looked at Reagan and J. Edgar Hoover and the writers, and these were a lot of Hollywood writers, the people that had come out and worked in Hollywood, that were being blacklisted in the years to come. And then, besides Interpol, looked into the Errol Flynn book. Where was Errol Flynn when he was active with Reagan? And Reagan was an informer for the FBI. And then what was Roosevelt doing with writers with Edgar Hoover in the same time period? So in the next half hour, I'm going to share that with you and go into the background, the milieu in which Reagan was in, being an FBI informer in 1941. We'll take a 1-minute break and then go back to that subject. And now I'll begin the second part of World Watchers, going into the Interpol connections of J. Edgar Hoover, just a few pages, to share with you what J. Edgar Hoover was doing at a time when Ronald Reagan was his informer. I think that is very important to have this different perspective now, of thinking that these documents at this late date are coming out to tell us about our great president as an informer in 1941. From the Interpol Connection, this is a book written by Vaughn Young and Trevor Johnson. Just a few pages to share on that. During the time of J. Edgar Hoover's relations with Interpol, this is in 1939 and 1940, with Interpol, he was close to W. Flesher, a Third Reich criminal police commissioner, and a Hoover admirer who wrote the FBI in June of 1939, thanking him for the FBI's annual report, proudly informing him that J. Edgar Hoover is part of the Third Reich's fingerprint division, that they had 371 fingerprint records, and they shared them with the Third Reich. He enclosed a photograph of Berlin's new police laboratory and concluded, "May I have a personal favor? I'd deeply be grateful if you would send me a photograph of yourself with a little dedication." So they sent a photograph. This was after the fall of Czechoslovakia. In June of 1939, a year after Congress authorized the FBI to join Interpol. Now, this is in 1939. They've been in Czechoslovakia in September. They'll go into Poland. The FBI officials exchanged notes back and forth, and Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer's SS chief, was sending an invitation to our FBI people to reply to Oskar Dressler, one of the top Nazis. This is July 1939, to come to the German embassy for a party that Interpol was going to have. The Interpol published criminal statistics for the FBI and gave them to J. Edgar Hoover and explained, and Hoover was vice president of Interpol, that a criminal is determined according to race and attributed the cause of crime to racial differences. And the Nazi philosophy was spelled out that people were classified as antisocials or genetically inferior. Jews and gypsies were determined to be genetically inferior and automatically branded as criminals. And the Nazis established a criminal biological institute to deal with antisocials and criminal kinships, and they were getting ready to get rid of those kinds of people. Those were to be the criminals. And Interpol in 1940, the head of it was Reinhard Heydrich, a man who came up with the final solution along with Eichmann. He was the head of Interpol, and he was the head of the German security police. Reinhard Heydrich consolidated his position, became president of Interpol in 1940, and J. Edgar Hoover was part of the Interpol operation, and also Secretary General Dressler praised Mr. Stuckhart's anti-Semitic positions in the Third Reich, and they were going over their passport standardizations for Interpol with all these various fingerprints. On April 15th, 1941, the organization and all of its permanent machinery was moved to Berlin, And it was in the suburb of Berlin is where Heinrich came up with the final solution. This was in Interpol Journal number 5 of June 41. This is the time period when Ronald Reagan was informer for the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was a vice president of Interpol. The Nazis were ready to invade Poland, but they'd already taken Czechoslovakia. And their journal discusses the tools that the Nazis have to use and concentration camps and so forth. This is in the journals. Much of the Gestapo stories in 1941, J. Edgar Hoover corresponding back and forth. In Denmark, another man who'd been a delegate to Interpol before the war did well with his new masters. By 1941, Mr. Egil Jacobsen was appointed Minister of Justice in Denmark, solidifying his police power and establishing the Interpol connections in Nazi Germany. And with J. Edgar Hoover over here in the United States, December the 1st, that's just 6 days before the Pearl Harbor, 1941, the FBI's 9-man executive conference recommended that there be no further communications with Interpol. Now, there have been many stories that J. Edgar Hoover knew about Pearl Harbor in advance. I've read these stories and have a lot of material I didn't bring in, I can do, on J. Edgar Hoover's knowledge. So 6 days before Pearl Harbor, a letter was sent to J. Edgar Hoover from Interpol, from General Dreiser, Secretary General Dreiser, and they said the FBI would now sever with Interpol at this point, and they already had been in Poland in 1939, invaded Poland. December the 4th, 1941, 3 days before the United States ended the war, J. Edgar Hoover issued a memo saying it is desired that in the future no communications be addressed to the International Police Commission, whose present location is in Berlin, Germany. Now, that's a little bit late. January the 2nd, 1942, was the Wannsee Conference outside of Berlin, where 16 top Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann and Mr. Heinrich, decided that the final Jewish problem, the final solution, would take place to get rid of all the Jews and the Gypsies in 1942. But J. Edgar Hoover very nicely severed just days before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and Ronald Reagan was an informer for the FBI during those exact days. The Washington Post had a story December 13th, 1983, about confidential files of J. Edgar Hoover that had been accumulated by 1941. Again, he was exchanging this information with Nazi Germany, and information was being put in about Hollywood from this. This is the interim of the Errol Flynn era that I'll go into again in detail. I've had on the air before. And this article from the Washington Post in 1983 said J. Edgar Hoover started what he called official and confidential file. Only 700 documents have been released. There are another 10,000 pages that were not released by 1983. These were started 2 years after Hitler invaded Poland, which would be invaded in 1939. That's 2 years later. And they were forced, these documents were put together by J. Edgar Hoover starting in 1941. Even Franklin Roosevelt asked J. Edgar Hoover to look into Herbert Hoover because he thought he was working with the Vichy government in France and suspected him. But it was Herbert Hoover that appointed J. Edgar Hoover to be the FBI director. So you know how far that went. And also the Washington Post, December 13, 1983, says that a former FBI agent was an aide to Senator Joseph McCarthy. And, of course, as soon as the war was over, Joseph McCarthy had gone right to Dachau prison to make sure that, among others, Fritz Kramer was released at a time period where he easily could have then come directly to the Pentagon, and he'd recruited Henry Kissinger, and he was brought into this country by Peter Drucker. There were FBI people around Joe McCarthy, and the FBI were part and parcel of the Interpol Nazi connections. Now, several weeks ago, in talking about the poems of Robinson Jeffers and Franklin Roosevelt, I cited some examples. One was, and these are from George Seldy's newsletter. In fact, one was an article, 300 U.S. writers suppressed. Now, keep in mind what was going on in Hollywood with the writers and with Ronald Reagan. By 1940, the suppression was taking place with writers, By 1941, the documents say he was an informer for the FBI. Seldes writes, Roosevelt quits the Writers' League, and people who think Franklin Roosevelt is so liberal, 800 members of the Writers' League felt that he had thrown away and abandoned the New Deal, that he was now working with fascism and fighting the people who were fighting fascism, that he had gone to the side of the corporations. This is what George Seldes was writing. And in 1941, June 41, when Reagan was an informer for the FBI, George Seldes was writing about a man named Frank Buchman, Buchman, and he started the moral rearmament movement. During the war, he was close to Rudolf Hess, to the Nazis. He helped with the plots that Hess was doing in Britain to switch the war against Russia and that Great Britain would be let off free. This man, Buchman, started the moral rearmament group, and Ronald Reagan went directly into his group in Hollywood and was a member of the moral rearmament. Now, when Reagan was starring with Errol Flynn in 1940, Flynn took a little time off and went to the Bahamas to meet top Nazis, and his agent, Dr. Urban, was voyaging all around the world and talked with Nazis in this period. But among the crowd that Urban and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and Axel Wenner-Gren of the Electrolux firm belonged to was the Buchman group. This Buchman, who had a lot of influence in Great Britain with the British Tory circle and the fascists, and opened up a group in the United States. And Ronald Reagan was part of the moral rearmament in Hollywood in the very early 50s. So not only was he an informer during this time period, but he worked with Buchman. And George Seldes, in fact, writes the Buchmanism, the original appeasement movement, and it tells about Buchman was for Adolf Hitler and boasted in 1939 that the surrender of Czechoslovakia to Hitler was their work, that he helped with that, and he had a glowing report of Mussolini, and they openly endorsed Adolf Hitler. And Buchman said, I thank heaven for a man like Adolf Hitler, and that with someone like Hitler, we'll have a God-controlled democracy. These are quotations of Buchman. Among Buchman's converts were several Nazi baronesses, Nazi leaders, American Wall Street men, Dr. Shipler, the editor of Churchman Report, and Jewish rich men, including Louis Mayer. Now, Louis B. Mayer was the head of MGM. Louis B. Mayer was working with Ronald Reagan as an informer to get those kind of people out. Louis B. Mayer happened to be a very close friend of my parents. I grew up in that part of town. In fact, he wanted to put, I mentioned on the air once before, he wanted to put on my wedding and have a big wedding at the temple. And, of course, I didn't go for that. But Ronald Reagan was working with Louis B. Mayer in the 40s during this time period when he was co-starring with Flynn. Louis B. Mayer was working with Buchman. And it was at the MGM studios that Nancy Davis came from Chicago and was taken care of by Mervyn LeRoy and Ida Koverman. Now, Ida Koverman, I've mentioned this before in programs, was the secretary for Louis B. Mayer. I have about 40 autographed pictures of the top stars of MGM at that time that she gave to me. She was the woman who always arranged when we went in and out of the studio. She not only was a secretary for Louis Mayer, she was the secretary for Herbert Hoover at the same time. Hoover had put J. Edgar Hoover into the FBI, and our FBI director was close to Interpol. And this letter of George Seldes, the newsletter, describes Buchman and Hitler and Mussolini, the close affinity, Reagan working with Buchman in the 50s, and in that time period, putting him in the FBI in the 40s in this milieu is a totally different scene than the Cold War in the 50s. And then I cited several weeks ago the newsletter of George Seldes. The FBI is supported by Franklin Roosevelt. He supported him 100%, Seldes wrote, in 1941. This is the time our president was an informer. Roosevelt said he supported him 100%. And Seldes wrote many, many newsletters about Franklin Roosevelt and the artists and the writers and the affinity for the FBI director who was doing these various activities. And he also knew that he was working with Interpol. The President of the United States would have to know that. And that is the role that J. Edgar Hoover had. Now, I got out the book on Errol Flynn that Charles Hyam wrote called The Untold Story, and just turned into a couple of pages Well, if Flynn and Reagan were acting together and were in this milieu, what was Flynn doing? In case you don't remember or didn't hear those sections, I've had them on the air before. I think I have, maybe not. In October 1940, that's when he's ready to co-star with Reagan, Errol attended a party at the home of a Brazilian ambassador. It was full of Nazis. Among them were George Geisling, Consul General in Los Angeles, Fritz Wiedemann, Consul General in San Francisco. Federal agents watched Errol very closely at the party, accompanied by Johnny Meyer, who later goes on to work for the Hughes Corporation. He was seen talking cheerfully with Wiedemann, dancing with two Heil Hitler Nazi actresses, a Nazi nightclub singer. He was seen in close discussions with Wiedemann, members of the Brazilian film industry, and Nazi sympathizers. During the period, Errol was almost constantly in the company of Fritz Wiedemann. A local member of the FBI who wishes to be anonymous pointed out to his superiors that Errol should not consort with Wiedemann after 1939 if he were really a loyal British subject. Errol made intense love scenes with Nazi actress Gertrude Anderson, and the FBI started watching Errol in this time period, but Errol got to do everything he wanted with all the Nazis while the FBI was watching him, and while Ronald Reagan was co-starring with Errol Flynn, and Ronald Reagan was working for the FBI. Charles Hiram writes, Errol extracted no pleasure from making the film Santa Fe Trail, which he made with Ronald Reagan, and then it goes on to some of his adventures in this time period from 1940 to 42. On December the 17th, Errol Flynn set off for Honolulu. He was first in New York on business, then flew to Hawaii. He'd been in Hawaii dating a Nazi agent named Erna Bauer. The FBI was intercepting her telegram to him, which mentions the sinking of Allied ships, and to Fritz Wiedemann in San Francisco. And there's conversations going on about the ships being sunk, and they're letting Errol Flynn make the movies, and the FBI knows it all along. In the late summer and early fall of 39, this is before the 1940 movie he made with Reagan, Dr. Urban, who was the Gestapo control of Errol Flynn, was almost constantly in the service of German ships. He was issued German Nazi party cards authorized in May the earlier year. He sailed from Hamburg to South Africa, and he was in South America. And a lot of top Nazis are mentioned here in terms of his trip to Shanghai and the people that he was with. He was at a famous hamlet called the Hamlet, the home of spies, Nazi agents that guided U-boats against the British and American ships. Urban was afraid once he'd be arrested in South America. He was picked up in Argentina and had to explain his papers. The Gestapo headquarters at the German consulate provided Errol Flynn, or rather Dr. Urban, his controller, with a passport, a transit document forged by a Nazi specialist who became a member of the Sief conspiring in the Orient. He got a German passport with a German seaman's identification, added to credentials his Nazi party card, and so forth, and he goes to Montevideo, Uruguay, and then comes back, Dr. Urban, to Hollywood, where, he, as I say, he's very much in control of Errol Flynn. Urban was terrified when he was aboard one ship because there were 23 German employees of Standard Oil Company who were returning to Germany, and he knew the British patrols were watching the ships with Standard Oil going to the Nazis. That's the Chase Manhattan gang. Urban went to the German consulate again because he had to contact the Gestapo chiefs and arrange for his Nazi documents and authorizations to be put back into a good working system. He was a medical doctor. He went to a society physician in New York, and this book goes on with details about Dr. Urban. Dr. Urban had trouble renewing his passport papers. He had been a naturalized and American citizen in San Francisco. I've mentioned this many times before. He joined the Gestapo, came to San Francisco, was naturalized, and the Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, ordered the revocation of his citizenship, and Errol Flynn stepped in for Dr. Urban, and he contacts Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife. And Errol Flynn had met Mrs. Roosevelt at a party in the White House, and he used to join the Whitneys at fox hunting in Virginia. He knew they all hated Jews. They used to call him Flynnberg to annoy him. 1940 was an election, and Mrs. Roosevelt was on a nationwide tour on her husband's behalf. She met Errol Flynn in Miami, and he called her about revoking his friend, Dr. Urban's citizenship. So through Eleanor Roosevelt, Dr. Urban stayed in the United States. She helped him out, and what did she do? She contacted J. Edgar Hoover. Now, Hoover's FBI records knew that he was a Nazi in Hollywood and everywhere else, knew his connections with Errol Flynn, Dr. Urban's. So Eleanor Roosevelt calls J. Edgar Hoover, and Hoover now is employing about, the records say Reagan became their informer in 1941, 1940. He's filming movies with Errol Flynn. So she calls J. Edgar Hoover and the Secretary of Labor, and in March 1940, all the investigation of Gestapo agent Dr. Urban is over. Errol Flynn was suddenly able to move around. His friend was not deported. There was no threat to his Nazi friends. Dr. Urban then went on an expedition for the Rockefeller Institute. And this Charles Hyman's book says for months, the Warner Brothers had wanted Errol Flynn to undertake a Latin American tour to promote his pictures. And he got the go-ahead to go, and he was accompanied again by Johnny Meyer of the user organization. And on the trip, Errol Flynn and Johnny met Nazis of the highest level of the Gestapo in Buenos Aires, in Rio, in Chile, and other major cities. And he visited American ambassadors. He went aboard military and naval installations, boarded American ships, and had a great deal of intelligence around him in Mexico. Carl Schaefer's of Warner's Publicity met with him. Schaefer was warning him through his head office in New York to make sure Errol Flynn laid off his Nazi connections. But Hyam writes, in Buenos Aires, the American ambassador, Norman Armour, asked him point blank what his connection was with Urban, who was supposed to lose his American citizenship, who J. Edgar Hoover knew was a Gestapo person. And he said he was an acquaintance, and he defended him, and that he used an agent to clear him, Richard Hood of the FBI. Armour became alarmed and sent copies of the report on Errol to the offices of the Military Navy Intelligence, the Department of Justice, J. Edgar Hoover, the Attorney General, and the White House, and felt that if Errol was not a collaborator, he was flying in the face of information about Urban, whose name was in every newspaper and magazine, and Errol Flynn was no way an individual who could escape Urban and the Nazis and the grave suspicions around him. So Charles Hyam says in his book that the Latin American Council told Errol Flynn that he should slow down and not be seen with Urban so much. However, Mrs. Roosevelt's umbrella of protection held good, and by now the formidable Hollywood machinery designed to protect its own was working well. Hyam wrote, "It is hard to realize the extent of the studio's political influence at the time. One Hollywood executive said recently, we just constantly reminded Congress that they were working for us. The Nazis were working for us. We weren't working for them. We represented the public and big business. Stars were idols, and the public and they were our business. We didn't want our nest invaded, of course, by communists. We didn't welcome the FBI or anybody else who tried to expose our stars. If the devil himself or Hitler's brother had worked for Jack Warner, if he was making millions, he would have been protected." And Hyam goes on to say Urban was continuously active, talking about Nazism. He was accelerated by the protection Mrs. Roosevelt had given him. Errol Flynn was grateful, and then they had the audacity to put him into a CCC camp, the Civilian Conservation Camp, where Dr. Urban was working as a, quote, private citizen for people put into the CCC camp, and he was stationed at Fort Moultrie in South Carolina that was run by the military, trained, ready for soldiering at the time of national emergency, and they kicked him off the base because he praised Adolf Hitler and appreciated the talents of Adolf Hitler. Then they moved him to another CCC camp in Florida, and his behavior was so extreme, they took photographs. He was taking photographs of the training methods, the installations, the guns, the weapons, the layouts of the huts, the headquarters. This is this high Gestapo chief protected by J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, nationally, internationally, and he was bragging and talking about Nazism openly and praised when Hitler marched into Paris. He was delighted, and he even made efforts to drag out and whip the boys at the camp. And so they moved Dr. Urban out, and at the time, Claude Pepper of Florida was wondering about Dr. Urban's behavior. So that is the milieu of this person, Ronald Reagan, in the 1941 scene with J. Edgar Hoover, working at Warner Brothers and working with the Buchman moral rearmament with Louis B. Mayer, and at that time Nancy Davis's father, Dr. Loyal Davis, soon after the war was over in the Philippines with Reverend Gale, who started the identity movement, the religious right, and he was over there with Carl Willoughby, Mr. Wiedenbach, who graduated from Hitler's Kriegsacademy, chief of intelligence with Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. And I believe, as I've read many spy books, that this arrangement was made of Nancy and Ronald, that she became the control that took him over, and that time period where he appeared to be walking on democratic waters was the early Cold War period before his real informer tentacles came out, and that his recruitment in 1941 is crucial because it is consistent with everything that Ronald Reagan has done. There was an article in the Washington Post several years ago in 1982, 5 years ago. Reagan had been president 1 year, and it's titled, "This is a Strategy," and it's written by Stephen Rosenfeld. And in the big letters on top of the article, it said, "Reagan appears to accept the whole globe as the stage for American action, and all Soviet and radical challenges as fit for American rebuff." And the gist of the article is that Ronald Reagan, after 1 year, points to the fact that he wants to control the whole world. This was 1982. That he has a policy, a role in the policy to control the entire world. Reagan appears to accept the whole globe as the stage for American action, and all Soviet and radical challenges as fit for this rebuff. We cannot fix all the risks we face at once, William Clark said, this long friend of Ronald Reagan's, who brought Helene von Damme to this country, but we are working on it. And this article said that documents exist to show the American power in the event of a global war with the Soviet Union, and that Ronald Reagan was working there towards that. And Rosenfeld said, to me, what was the most disturbing about this national security strategy is it unrelievably had military tones. There's not a word about contribution to American security that involves solving a dispute, negotiating with adversaries, and conducting diplomacy. Now, that's what the enterprise is that we heard about during the Iran-Contra hearings, is this private hunk of money, and we don't know how many monies and millions, to keep the enterprise going. William Casey had 55 operations going at the time of his death. And that strategy, once Reagan was in, is completely consistent with the goals and aims that were stated a long time ago in 1941 and by J. Edgar Hoover in 1939, 1930, and Errol Flynn in the milieu in which he came. To conclude this, the article also mentioned that Caspar Weinberger and Alexander Haig stand there with the president. I understand, I was told this evening, that Caspar Weinberger is ready to resign. There are 1,000 reasons why he should. Usually when that happens, somebody worse gets in, but I don't think they grow them worse. And we'll talk about him. He's on the Monterey Peninsula right now, and I know he isn't listening to World Watchers, so I can talk about him. So I'm going to conclude this part of World Watchers and then continue with the talk show part in about 4 minutes. Before I finish, we want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that brought you the past hour of World Watchers. The previous hour, World Watchers, was made possible in part by Lowdown, a leading manufacturer of microcomputer peripherals located in Scotts Valley. For more information, call 438-7400. You hang on, and I'll be back.